Good evening. Thank you all for coming. People are still wandering in, but welcome to those of us who've already made it. And welcome to the first Ulster County History Mini Conference of 2020, replacing our usual Ulster County History Conference that we hold in the spring, which we had to cancel due to the pandemic. We're privileged to have County Executive Pat Ryan in attendance this evening, and he would like to make a few remarks to start the evening off for us. So County Executive Ryan, if you would like to start the program.
Thanks, Jeff. Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm coming from home, so if you hear my screaming one-year-old in the background, you know what that sound is, and I promise he's okay. But thank you for just having a minute or two to say hello and queue up what I know is going to be a really educational and informative and also critically important and timely conversation. So Jeff, thank you to you for adapting in this moment that we're in and making this work, and to everybody for joining. I just want to say that I think there couldn't be a better time for the conversations we're about to have and to hear from the fantastic folks that are going to present on this topic. We are undertaking, as we look forward, we're undertaking a series of what I hope are systemic and very, very bold reforms guided by community conversations to address generations-long inequities and injustices and inequalities in our county, in our state, and in our country. And as we do that, obviously, we have to make sure that as we look forward, we do it informed by a nuanced and full and honest look backwards at what we have done in the past, so as to inform what we can learn from, what we've done wrong, and the injustices that we need to correct. So that's why I'm personally looking forward to this, and really I hope that everyone both enjoys tonight, but also I invite you to take part in those forward-looking conversations we're having as well in the county through our Justice and Reform Commission, and invite you to participate in that throughout the coming months. So thank you again to Jeff for the incredible work you've been doing and continue to do on behalf of the county. And to those presenting tonight in advance, thank you. And I will stop there and hope everyone is healthy and okay. And I look forward to seeing everyone in person, hopefully very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks for the opportunity to be in a position to do this too. It's great. We're also fortunate to have the New York State historian with us, Devin Landers. He's been with us before, and I know he always enjoys getting out into the community and experiencing what we're all doing on the local level. And so I would like to give him an opportunity to say a few words to begin tonight's conference. So is Devin out there?
I'm here.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you, Jeff. And thanks to everyone for inviting me. This is certainly a very important conversation, and I congratulate Jeff for putting this together and for being flexible enough to understand the importance of the topic and understand the importance of this continued conversation. Unfortunately, due to the COVID, we can't be together, and conferences have been forced to go virtual across the state and across the country, really. But I really look at this as an opportunity, specifically as something that can stand and be imitated in other parts of the state. I think this is such a vital conversation that we have to have as historians, that we have to have as citizens. We have to understand what history is and the complexity of history. We have to listen to voices that have been written out of history in the past. And, you know, this is such a vital topic that again, I think these types of regional meetings are so important for the community to be able to come together and talk about how do we address these situations and how do we adapt to the reality of a changing landscape. So again, I'm excited to listen to the speakers. I think Jeff, just reading the abstracts, Jeff put together a great program for us. And I look forward to seeing where the conversation goes. So thank you so much for having me.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I do want to stress, by the way, that it's not me. It's me and a committee that is an incredible group of people. We love to meet together. We're always stimulated by the conversations that we have in putting these together. So I do want to also make sure that I thank Suzanne Hasbrook, Richard Heppner, Marnie Jansen, Audrey Klinkenberg, Gail Manny, Susan Sprackman, and Susan Stessen Cohen. All of the meetings that we've had in the past, and this one, grow out of really conversations, and that's the beauty of working, as historians with just the committed people that are a part of the community here. So thanks to the committee. So the annual Ulster County Conference has been a forum for bringing together the local historical community to explore a variety of issues for local historians and interpreters of local history, from access to information and resources to demonstrations of new ways to reaching out to the community. The idea for tonight's mini conference first came to me driving around the South in the summer before Charlottesville in 2017. On that trip, I became acutely aware of the tensions surrounding Confederate monuments and the Confederate flag, and began to muse about how we could turn the growing unrest on both sides of the divide into a teachable moment to forge a new sense of community to bind the American people. After Charlottesville, however, that dream of mine was overshadowed by a realization of the sheer magnitude of the situation and the heat of the passions of play. And quite frankly, I got cold feet. But then attention turned to Christopher Columbus, followed this last fall by Peter Stuyvesant. And then there we were with 3 statues in our own Academy Green, the subject of controversy. And I realized how irresponsible it would be for me to bury my head in the sand any longer. Luckily, the committee that works to put these conferences together needed no convincing. My thanks to the committee is sincere and very, deeply felt. My thanks also go out as well to Karen Levine for agreeing to take over the Zoom controls for the meeting. She's been a friend for a long time, and she just has a great mind and is really tuned into the subject. And to Susan Sprackman for volunteering to facilitate the question and answer period that will follow the presentation. The purpose of the conference tonight is to begin a conversation about what we as local and regional historians and interpreters of local history can do to bring the best of our tradecraft to a fair and honest exploration and reevaluation of our local and regional history to set the record straight. We will hear tonight from 3 speakers, each of whom has played an important part in bringing this conversation to this corner of the world. Their biographies in the order in which they will speak are as follows. First is Tyrone Wilson. Tyrone is the commissioner of, I can never remember this and I can't read my own writing, the Commissioner of Human Rights for Ulster County. And he describes himself as the founder of Harambee, who uses his life experiences to address the issues of today. Originally from Harlem, Tyrone was raised in the Mecca of Black knowledge and Black excellence. learning the lesson of the streets in Harlem where Malcolm X once walked, Marcus Garvey once spoke, Langston Hughes once lived, where the birth of the Million Man March was formed, home of one of the most biggest and long-lasting African American festivals in America, and the home of the world-famous Apollo Theater. Tyrone brings his experience and fight for equality to life by stating some of the untold truths about his ancestors and the stories that they don't teach or tell us. Tyrone joined us to shine a light on the untold truth of Africa, of African and African American people. Second speaker tonight is Richard Heppner, who is a part of the committee. Richard has served as the Woodstock town historian since 2001. His most recent book, Woodstock's infamous murder trial, Early Racism in New York, was released in March. In addition to numerous essays for local media, he is also the author of Women of the Catskills, Woodstock, Everyday History, and co-author of Legendary Locals of Woodstock. After serving in numerous academics over 25 years at Orange County Community College, he retired as Vice President of Academic Affairs at SUNY Orange and holds the rank of Professor Emeritus. Heppner also serves as an ex officio member of the Board of Directors of the Historical Society of Woodstock, is a member of the Executive Committee of Woodstock Birdcliff Guild, and is the former president of the Woodstock Artists Cemetery. In addition, he's currently in his 5th year as an elected member of the Woodstock Town Board. Reynolds Scott-Childress was originally from North Carolina. He earned his undergraduate degree at Columbia College and his PhD in history at the University of Maryland, where he studied with the preeminent historian of American slavery, Ira Berlin. He currently teaches U.S. history at SUNY New Paltz. So we're going to begin tonight with Tyrone.
Hi, thank you, Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you so much for having me. Thank you all. I had to scramble a little bit because I didn't make it out of the office, so I'm going to work this. So I just want to say thank you all for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this. My video can't come up because I don't have the right laptop to put my video up. There's no camera there.
Okay.
So I apologize for that. I do want to just talk about, I think when I got this call from Jeff, the first thing that came to mind was to go, take it back to our original form as African people. And what I'm going to talk about, it's not about the local, it's about the overall, as people of color. So I just want to, say that, because I think that we have to go back first to come up to understand, the purpose, the respect of humanity as people. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about the last slave ship that we know of, that was dated back in 1860. And I also want to acknowledge some of the great things that was created by people of color that we still utilize today. And I think it's important because I think a lot of the things that was created by people of color it's not told the way the way it should be to help people of color to continue to be a part of society and to continue to understand that we played a major part here as well. And the circumstances that we face, even in 2020, as people of color is to me is heartbreaking, that we still in this place. you know, that we can't see each other as human beings, and we still on a color war, you know, based on your color is based on where you are at in this world, or it's who you know if you're lucky, you know. So that's kind of where I'm coming from when you hear what I'm gonna talk about, and I won't be long before you, but I think that this was necessary, especially when, as you know, many of you may not know, I founded Harambee 4 years ago. We did purchase a burial ground here in Kingston, New York, on Pine Street. Um, that was this burial ground is dated back to the 1750 to the 1850s, and even with this burial ground here, right here where we at in Kingston, it's been highly disrespected. It's been thrown under the rug. The things that happen on this land is, you know, strikingly sad. You know, as far as, you know, how this site was taken care of, and I'm fortunate enough to be a part of a great team in collaboration with the Kingston Land Trust that was able to purchase and put a respect on this land of our ancestors that wasn't there prior to us purchasing it. So I'm going to begin with talking about the last slave ship a little bit. And by 1860, enslaved people were the foundation of the American economy, more valuable than all the capital investment and manufacturers, railroads, and banks combined. Cotton accounted for 35 to 40% of U.S. exports. Banks in U.S. around the world were pouring in money into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, invested in the plantations, southern banks, and enslaved people who could be mortgaged. There was the last ship that was known was called, and I probably it was two things. Some people call it Calito, and I call it the Colita. And that is, and the Colita is was the last known slave ship that was known to my knowledge in history, and that is spelled Clotilda. In 1860, years after the United States had banned the import of slaves, a wealthy landowner hired the schooner, and it's the cap, and it was a shooter, and it was the captain, and they smuggled more than 100 African captives into Alabama. This crime was punishable by hanging. So, in other words, this was the last smuggled ship that came into the States. This ship, when it got to the States, this ship was set ablaze to destroy the evidence. The captives were the last of an estimated 370,000 Africans that was delivered into bondage into the mainland of America. And this was dated from the early 1600s to 1860. So by 1860, when we started, and it makes sense to me more because our burial ground here that we have here at the Pine Street burial ground was dated to 1850, and which that was the last date of a known remain that was buried there at this site. So when we're looking at the years, and we're looking at the years of the times that all this is happening, our burial ground here is dated from 1750 to 1850, which means there's a highly likely that a lot of those enslaved people that was brought over during that time was brought and was right here in Ulster County, as they was brought and paid to be here. So learning about Black history truths will help end racism. It helps students and parents. It gives a full and honest view of African Americans, and it helps fight all the miscommunications of self-respect about African American people. when we tell stories of African American people here in America, it always presented in a manner of unfortunate, oppressed, enslaved, or just dark and distressed views. Although we talk of this about African Americans, we look upon it as pity or lack of, or not worthy. But if our accomplishments was told truthfully and honestly without hidden agendas, descendants of our ancestors will know how strong we really are. To be able to still accomplish the major things we have accomplished here in America with all the beatings, rapings, hangings, the shootings, and the slaughters of our people, we have still done the most work in this land. Almost everything you see today or heard about in the history is connected to a person of color who invented it. So I'm going to give out some names here. So as we talk about the air conditioning unit, Frederick M. Jones, 1949. We have the cellular phones, Henry T. Sampson, 1971. We have the elevator, Alexandra Miles, 1867. The refrigerator, J. Standard, 1891. Horseshoes, J. Ricks, 1885. We have the gas mask, Garrett Morgan, 1914. The fire extinguishers, T. Marshall, 1872. We also have the automatic gear shifts in your cars, Richard Spikes, 1932. Could you imagine if people of color were told the truth about their contributions to America? Do you know how much America owed the descendants of African people for the contributions to this stolen land? African Americans still haven't received their reparations. Is it because we still living in a world who doesn't see us fit on this land? So I say this as far as we talk about African American people, the shortage of who we are that's told to prior generations and newer generations is lacking major truths. I think that when we get to the point where we are seen as people who contribute to this land as well, I think that we will understand that we, regardless of the enslavement, we know that happened. We can't take that back, and that's understandable. But we always have time to fix that notion and to move forward in those pains to bring a new mindset to how we look at each other as human beings. The lack of education of Black history in our schools is damaging. I think when our kids, white or Black, don't understand the contributions, and all they see and all they hear about people of color is that we are either enslaved, we are a lack of to this community. I've myself, as a young man growing up in Harlem, I gotta tell you, all I heard was Martin Luther King, and we really didn't go no further than that. Maybe Benjamin Banneker, but as a young man growing up in Harlem, and as rich as Harlem was in Black history, I still wasn't educated on who I was and where I came from. I only heard that I was an enslaved person, or my ancestors was. I didn't hear about how we was kings and queens. I didn't hear about, how rich our land was. I didn't even hear about Africa. I saw little videos of Ethiopia, and they show some of the poorest parts of Africa, that if we don't know no better, that's all we would think of as what Africa looks like. But Africa is so beautiful. Africa is so rich. But we was never exposed to that, as people of color. And majority of the times, as we coming up in this world today, we constantly just trying to fit in. We constantly is trying to feel like a place to belong. And if we are in any type of positions, we either lucky or we know someone. And I think we are so much better than that. As a matter of fact, I know we are so much better than that. And as we did this past year with the burning of Kingston, we wanted to acknowledge that, you know, we were there. We were rebellious. We didn't just sit there and get whipped. We didn't just be obedient. We fought. We fought the best way we knew how. And our strength and our resilience shows in us today. Um, I am, even as a Black man, I am amazed about all the things that my ancestors has been through, and the fact that I'm still here today. I'm amazed by that, because sometimes I ask myself, how do we take all of this? How do we hold this burden? You know, how are we still here? I ask myself that. You know, so I will look as locally when we dealing with a lot of the stuff here, as far as local laws and law enforcement, in the constant engagement in fights with law enforcement and people of color, and how we are, you know, how we are looked upon. It shows even in the law enforcement that, you know, when you approach a Black man, there's a high percentage that there is going to be confrontation. So if you have law enforcement who really, you know, believe in that message, then you have to ask yourself, if they are taught that, can we fault them for how they engage with us when they pull us over, when they stop us? Because if you're taught this, and if you are shown this, what do we really expect from them? And these are the things that we have to ask ourselves, not just a person of color, but just as people, period. We can't disregard what is being taught. Officers was kids at once as well. They grew up. You know, everybody's not, you know, nobody is born racist. Nobody is born with hate. All that is taught. So until we really dig down and say to ourselves, how do we change the message that we sent in at the start of our kids being in pre-K, going to daycares, in our households, in our communities? All that plays a part of how we look at each other. All that plays a part of what we take in and how we deal with whatever situations that has been embedded in us. So I want to say to everyone, as far as how we change our times together as people, how we look at each other. I would love to see the day that we start looking at each other as human beings first. I would love the day that we can get past the color aspect of being humans. I would love to see the day that I can, you know, go to a person that, you know, is not the same color as me, and I can hug that person. That person can hug my kids. I can hug that person's kids. I would love to see the day, and I may not see that day, but if you ask me what I want, that's what I will want to see, as far as not just a community, but just a world of peace. And I think that we have more fight and more harm amongst each other than we have peace. And I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate the time.
Thanks, Tyrone. And I just want to add personally that I've learned more from Tyrone in the past 2 years that I've known him, about, you know, the looking at the world through the eyes of African Americans, and seeing how little I understand, even though I grew up in Manhattan and I taught in schools that had large Black populations. And with the work that he has done in the community here in Kingston is special in a way that I can't even describe. I had originally asked him to be a part of the original conference, the one that was before the pandemic, because the way he was developing the slave cemetery or the slave burial ground was just incredible. Bringing in kids from the beginning, having them design the space, what they wanted, sort of really making sure that we understood that this is their sacred place. These are their ancestors. And it was just totally, not the way I would have done things as a historian going in. And it's just tremendous, tremendous to see what the energy and the insight that he brings to the community. So thanks, Tyrone. So the next presentation is by Richard Heppner, who wrote a book about our own To Kill a Mockingbird experience here in Ulster County. So Richard, are you ready to come
Yes,
forward?
sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Tyrone. I may be the Woodstock historian, but it's like I grew up in Kingston until I was about 15 years old, and I followed the work you folks are doing, and it's impressive, and thank you for that. Well, since I'm saying thanks, I want to thank also Jeff and our whole group. But Jeff's leadership has been great, and it's been a pleasure, Jeff, working with you. Jeff is better at Zoom presentation decor, though. I notice he's got a lot of his bookshelf in the background. I think you're supposed to have I only got a little bit, so I'll probably flunk the New York Times test. But here we all are. And who would have thought we'd be meeting like this 6 months ago, and why didn't I invest in Zoom 6 months ago? And yet our history keeps churning. And I think it's important to, at least at the outset here, to acknowledge all in the history community who have managed to adapt and continue their work, especially historical societies that had to cancel exhibits and talks, but also still had to send off the checks to the utility companies. Also, thanks to the historians who continued their work, preserving the historical record, whether it's been documenting protests and Black Lives Matter movement in our area, or the impact of COVID I know a lot of folks are working on. This surprisingly has been a busy time. And I don't know, perhaps someday someone will document the documentarians, at least I hope so. In some respects, I guess I'm here to talk about my perspective as a town historian and as someone who is closely associated with the Historical Society of Woodstock, but to speak on my own thoughts about where we are today as keepers of local history, and frankly, where I see our obligation is to use our positions in our institutions, backed by documented research, of course, to openly deal with a past that has promoted discrimination and hatred. Jeff mentioned my recent book, and by the way, don't ever release a book 2 weeks before a worldwide pandemic and everything's shutting down. It's not good for sales. But as Jeff mentioned it, local history doesn't really diverge too far from our national story. And I think we sometimes forget that. And when you begin to look a little closer, you'll find, that statement is often true. Problem is, local keepers of history often neither have the resources nor the time to pursue loose ends that might bring a more complicated or a more complete story into focus. So like many of you as a public historian or as a member of a historical society, we take on traditional outlines of our town's history. when we first begin to serve. Each town, of course, has its major events, its movers and shakers over the years, and we tend to adopt that outline as we go about our exhibits and our talks and our research. And I understand why we do that. We do it here in Woodstock, I do it. And of course, we want to celebrate that which is good about our past. It doesn't hurt that it also draws more public notice because it rings familiar. It's often when newcomers come to the area that they want to first learn about. And, possibly it also helps attract the most membership, the most donations and purchases in our gift shops. And I'm not saying we need to abandon that outline or the major points in our history or in our stories, but they'll always be there. So the question I ask is, what isn't there? What is left out of those stories? What is left out of our history? What is missing? And what's usually missing are the interconnecting individual lives upon which the foundation of that history was built. I saw a headline in the New York Times the other day about building monuments to unknown lives. And I would certainly agree with that, but perhaps I would change the headline to building monuments to undiscovered lives, because they are out there and we need to seek them out. As I said, I can only speak for myself and my own journey. Certainly when I became town historian 20 years ago, I followed the traditional outlines. The general story: early settlers, a passing reference to Native Americans, farming, early industries, boarding houses, artists, world wars, beatniks and hippies, and probably spent most of my time responding to questions, where was the festival? But once you get that basic outline down, I think you tend to feel pretty comfortable, and perhaps, and I will speak for myself, maybe too comfortable, because you start getting comfortable, you start to wonder, what are you overlooking? How much history is being left out? And when you get comfortable, many lives in that way can be left behind. So much of our foundation can go unnoticed. And when the foundation isn't complete, our houses of history aren't too solid. I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool follower of Howard Zinn, but something he wrote once has stayed with me since I first read it a number of years ago. Zinn urged that we, quote, need to emphasize new possibilities by disclosing those hidden episodes of the past, when, even if in brief flashes, people showed their ability to resist, to join together, and to occasionally win. So let me talk about my recent journey with that in mind in regards to the recent book. Over the years, as I'm sure many of you have, I've learned to be an explorer of footnotes, bibliographies, and author's notes. Again, in an effort to try to get away from the basic outline. And that's kind of how I discovered, or should I say stumbled, upon the subject of the book, Woodstock's infamous murder trial, early racism in upstate New York. I discovered it, or stumbled upon it, leafing through Alf Everett's book on the history of Woodstock. And I came across a note on this murder that happened in our town in 1905, and a reference to a black man who was arrested for killing a white man. What? First I heard of it. But all I had was a name. The name was Cornell Van Gansbeek. So now what? How do I pull all the threads on this one to find out more? Let's face it, Woodstock, like many of our small towns, doesn't have a whole lot of Black history to refer to or to fall back on, especially when that history has been built on a population that's probably 98% white, or when historians who do the writing and do the preserving are white, and that tried and true outline has become entrenched. The chances of deviation tend to get diminished. Long story short, it took me about a year to pull the threads of this story together. eventually finding out that the original presentation of what happened to Cornell Van Gaesbeek, the man arrested, was all wrong. Just as important, however, was what I learned along the way through my research and really how incomplete on some levels our history can be and the parallels we can actually find if we go looking with today. And to be clear, this turned out to be not just a story about Woodstock, but it's also a story about Kingston and Ulster County. First, the original history has Cornell Van Gaesbeek found guilty. He was, but that is very far from how the story actually ends. Lesson learned, don't always assume previous printed accounts or historic records are correct. Second, yes, there was a reason to suspect Van Gaesbeek in the murder, but no other trails, as you look into it, were ever followed. The black man did it from the start. When other leads were presented, they simply were not acted upon. In fact, the local press, in an editorial, commended law enforcement for the swiftness of his apprehension and the speed at which he was brought to trial and initially convicted. Continuing, and you can go back and find these articles, the press of the day also fed off or created additional problems for his case, falling upon typical stereotypes of Van Gaesbeek as, quote, shiftless, lazy, was a drunk, couldn't hold a job. Fact was, trying again to pull those threads wherever I could find them, the man, Van Gaesbeek, had been gainfully employed for a number of years as a coachman for a couple of prominent Kingston families. Fourth, and this is an area I believe we tend to forget about in our local histories when looking back, especially towards the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. And it's an area that needs far deeper examination when it comes to local history and racism's role within that. I'm talking about the overall legal environment. I'm talking about specific things like even jury selection. Cornell Van Gaesbeek was the only black man in the room when he went on trial. Twice he faced an all-white jury. The prosecutors were white, the judge was white, and his lawyer was white. But let me tell you, he had a pretty damn good lawyer. As Jeff kind of mentioned, sort of the Atticus Finch of the whole story. And it was in the jury selection process that that lawyer, a man by the name of Augustus Van Buren, also a historian, went directly to the question of race and the racial attitudes of potential jurors. Now, these jurors weren't virulent members of KKK. They were farmers, mill workers, clerks, etc. If you want, call them everyday people. But their responses to Van Buren's questions spoke to the reality of racism in their day. Certainly, when asked point blank if they might be prejudiced against a black defendant, they responded no. But further questioning undermined their initial responses. And this is throughout this trial and the second trial. Said one, nothing against blacks, I just wouldn't hire one. Or another, well, sir, I don't think much of a black person as much as I do a white man. And you kind of get the picture there. And finally, in a decision that would serve as a basis for appeal in this case, the county judge, Judge Cantine at the time, refused to allow character witnesses on behalf of the defendant, including a Woodstock constable who had known the defendant for years and was set to testify as to his honesty and his peaceful nature. Perhaps black defendants didn't have character. But beyond the saga of Van Gaesbeek, however, there's also much to unveil as you start exploring these stories about our area and the plight of blacks during this period. For example, black men sitting drinking in a bar it wasn't uncommon for them to be set upon and beaten by whites who didn't want to drink with blacks. And after the fight, police would first go to the area in Kingston that was predominantly black to effect arrests. Young black women accosted on the streets by whites. Workers in local brickyards threatening to strike if blacks making the migration north were hired. And even in peace and love Woodstock, a Ku Klux Klan meeting in the 1920s, which attracted, quote, according to a newspaper article, quote, some of our favorite businessmen. All these are but one example of where we can go when we embark on a more detailed journey in pursuit of our local history. These stories are there. These lives are there. In fact, since I finished my book, I've become aware of at least 2 other cases of a very similar nature during a similar time. Each involves the trial of a black man for murder. Each involves a guilty verdict. One even carried the death penalty. Each involves an appeal. Each had a second trial, and each were acquitted following the second trial. In short, my subject, Cornel van Gaspik, was not some isolated case where the suspect just happened to be black. So what I found along the way, even though we public historians tend to work alone, is that there's so many resources today available to us and to assist us. In many ways, you know, through technology, we are the new generation of historians and historical societies, with resources our predecessors couldn't even have dreamed of. Resources that allow us to explore that which previously has gone unexplored, to find and discover lives that need to be discovered, and facts that can guide our communities as we deal with these difficult days. You know, I truly believe that as public historians and as keepers of our area history, that we need to be actively involved when it comes to whatever decisions are being made today, whether it's about statues, building names, street names, whatever the issue is. We need to be out there and we need to be engaged, not involved to advance personal opinion, but involved so that the decisions made by our communities are based on the facts as we can best provide them. And so I kind of conclude where I began. You know, what is our obligation to the present? And how can we best go forward as a historical society or as a public historian to meet those obligations? And I hope as we go along tonight, we can make that part of our further discussion. Thank you. Thank you again, Jeff.
Thanks, Richard. Richard was one of the first people I reached out to for help when I became the Ulster County historian. We met for coffee in Woodstock and met a few times. And when it came time to think of a committee that might help me, he was one of the first people I reached out to. He's just, he's like a rock, I think, when it comes to someone who's grounded in really what this is all about. And
Can I get my wife in here to hear this?
yeah, no, it's really a, you know, a privilege to work with you, and I thank you very
As it is with you, sir.
much. Yeah, thanks a lot. And so we're going to turn to the last speaker for the evening. That's Rennie, Scott-Childress. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Ah, great. Welcome, and thanks a lot.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for the invitation. I appreciate your kind offer for me to take part in this. I'm glad to see so many people are virtually out tonight, despite the fine weather for once here this summer. So I'm here to talk about a big project we undertook at SUNY Paltz. I teach history there. My specialty is cultural history. I really enjoy looking at the way people live their daily lives. In my classes, we talk much more about those sorts of things rather than focusing just on the heroes of history per se, presidents and so forth. We really look at how it is that people had to make difficult decisions in their daily lives as they faced different circumstances that history brought to them. And we ended up having a similar sort of circumstance at SUNY New Paltz. It happened when around late 2016, a worker at the what was then the Hasbrook dining hall named Daryl Thompson died at a tragically early age, natural causes. But he had been, he was an alumnus of SUNY New Paltz, and he had been involved about 20-something years before in the 1970s in an event that had become part of our history, racial history there. He was an African-American man and had been in the dining hall, different dining hall back then. And there was a kind of disagreement because some folks were listening to music, some other folks thought it was too loud. And before you knew it, the other folks called the police on Daryl Thompson and his friends. And instead of it being, a local SUNY New Paltz thing, the New Paltz police, not just the SUNY police, showed up. And this went down as an example of how white folks at New Paltz react to a lot of different sorts of stimuli. So when Daryl died, there had been concern a long time among various activists on campus that several of the buildings were named after the original patentees or their families. It was unclear. And if they were named after the original patentees, of course, there was a great concern that these patentees had been slaveholders. Again, not completely clear. So there was a petition drive begun to rename Hasbrook Dining Hall in Daryl's name. So the president, Don Christian, listened to the concerns of the folks who were developing the petition. This, of course, was in the context, 2016, 2017, of a large movement across the country to really rethink a lot of the statutes that had been produced in the decades after the Civil War, statutes that lionized the leaders of the former Confederacy. And these, of course, were put up many decades after the war, not really in terms of hero worship of the leaders of the Confederacy, but as means of supporting the new Jim Crow regime that a lot of the southern states were developing around the turn of the 20th century. So in this context, President Christian decided that we need to have a deeper look and really think about the names of not just Hasbrook Dining Hall, but the other buildings of that complex that were named after the original patentees. So fortunately or unfortunately, he had just developed a committee on campus called the Diversity and Inclusion Council. And before we'd really gotten very much involved or started, he asked us to look into this issue and see whether we could show that the buildings were named after the original patentees and whether we could show that those patentees were in fact slaveholders. And then the second part of his charge to us was, if they were slaveholders, what would be the proper, the responsible path to follow given the claims of the campus to be dedicated to the values of diversity, inclusion, and equity. So I was fortunate enough to be appointed to be co-chair of the D&I Council, along with Tahina Pacheco-Dunn, who is on the administrative side of things. We had a team of really great people on the council at the time, including Ken Goldstein and some others. And we began thinking about how would we figure this process out. It was clear that we needed to do history. It was clear that we needed to do some research, but all the research in the world doesn't matter if you can't get people to talk about the issue and really think it through and feel what the problems might be, understand the harms that some people are expressing, understand the values, the heritage that some people feel about those names, and about the history of New Paltz, going back to the original patentees and beyond to Europe. So we started a two-pronged approach. One was to actually do the research, look into history, and the other one was to think about a way to create community dialogue. So in doing the history, we started going like any historian does. We went down to Elting Library. We went to the special collections at SUNY New Paltz. We looked through old newspapers. We looked at published books. We looked at the Ulster County archives. And we began to amass a history of not just the original patentees, but the families that followed, so that we could show that the original patentees were in fact slaveholders, but that there were some very powerful moments in their descendants' history. So one of those powerful moments, of course, was Abraham Hasbrook, who served as a lawyer in Kingston in the 1820s and was approached by Sojourner Truth, who at the time was known as Isabella Van Wagenen, because her son had been illegally sold there at the sunset of slavery in New York State. He'd been illegally sold down in Alabama. So she approached Abraham Hasbrook, and he took her case pro bono. She was the first, of course, Black woman to bring a case of any type in New York State and win with Hasbrook's help. There were, of course, the later generations of the patentees who were instrumental in creating various educational institutions in New Paltz, including the first New Paltz school, high school, if you will, as a private school. These were the forebears of SUNY New Paltz. So as we looked at the history, we discovered, in fact, by looking at a lot of different documents, that of the 7 or so original patentees, we could show that at least 6 of them, 6 of the 8 or so, were in fact slaveholders. We used wills, we had some other documents that we were able to look at that demonstrated that they in fact were slaveholders. Now the next problem was to figure out who the buildings were actually named for. Were they named for these specific individuals, or were they named in general after the families? That meant doing some history to the 1950s. So as we looked into this history, what became clear is that the context for thinking about the past was quite different in the 1950s than it is today, of course. Crucial aspect of that context was we were involved in the Cold War. There was a lot of very powerful impetus to look at the United States as distinct, very different from Europe, powerful impetus to look for heroes in the American past. And a lot of that heroism was rooted in the idea of who was first, who came here first from Europe and set up our original towns. So of course, when the officials at New Paltz at the time were looking to rename some new building, or to name some new buildings, they looked to these pioneers. And in that context too, you know, there was a very powerful public excitement about certain pioneer whites in America, people like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. And so to some degree, the officials who named these buildings were looking at that same kind of popular culture, that sense of these unproblematic whites who went out into either an empty nature or one filled with the stereotypical Indians of that day. So we were able to find out that their interest was not in the families per se, but in naming the buildings after the original patentees, the first Europeans to settle New Paltz and create a European-style community here on the banks of the Wallkill. So once we discovered that, then the next question was, what do we do with this information? How do we work this? Because we knew that there were a lot of different stakeholders. On the campus itself, there were a number of activists who were adamant, just change the names. No need to talk about it. If you can show that they're slaveholders, just change the names. That's all there is to it. There were other students who already had a strong feeling that the buildings had been named, not a big deal. We knew too that there would be alumni who would have a very different kind of feeling, some on both sides of the issue. Some had powerful memories of having lived in these dorms, having lived in these buildings. So as we looked at the different stakeholders, we decided that the most important thing would be to have a series of listening sessions. Some of those would be in-person listening sessions, and others would be more data-driven. So sending out questionnaires, for example, to all the alumni who had lived on on campus when those buildings had those names. So we were doing both data research to find out what different people would believe or be concerned with. We were also doing these listening events, and these had a really powerful effect. We set clear ground rules for each of the listening events. The idea was not to attack individuals, but to express one's own feelings. We set, a goal of really trying to ask questions that were open-ended so that we didn't lead the discussion in any sort of way. And there were some powerful moments in these discussions. One in particular, there was a man who was a descendant of the Huguenots who came in really ready not to hear any argument against keeping the names. They were there, it was history, didn't want history erased. And he made this very clear at the beginning of the discussion. But there was one young African-American woman who was living in one of the dorms at the time. And she gave a very heartfelt expression of what it meant, being the descendant of slaves, what it meant to her to live in a building that was named for people who had been slaveholders, what it meant for her to have to live under the aegis of this person who had engaged in the kind of punishments, behaviors, unfreedom that her ancestors had experienced. And she talked about how this really diminished her ability on campus to see our values of inclusion, diversity, and equity as being valid. As she spoke and really helped us to see what it meant to live in this environment, literally inside this building named after a slaveholder, it was fascinating because the man who at first had said, no way you're going to change the names, he didn't come around completely, but he was moved. It was clear he was moved, and he thanked her for what she said. He then, in a sense, restated it. So it was clear that he understood and had really gotten what she said. So we worked hard to bring all the different stakeholders together, bring them together in different sorts of ways. And as we evaluated the materials, the D&I Council then came to the conclusion that there was a clear movement among those who responded, who spoke to us, to change the names. We thought, well, that's that. So we put out a report that we sent to the president. We recommended, given all of the data that we'd seen, the history that we had, all the stories that we'd heard, that the preponderant movement here was for changing the names. What we hadn't recognized was that there was a group called the College Council. The College Council has certain powers that are above those of the president, but they're not quite at the level of SUNY Central. And for the most part, these the people who are on these are first they're appointed by the governor. The governor, in this case, though, had not appointed new members, and so in a long time. So we were down from the 10 we were supposed to have to just 7. Of those 7 who were serving, they had been serving way beyond the time when they were supposed, when their official periods were done. So they were not really prepared in some ways, I think, to take on this issue. And it was very difficult to try to speak with them, get them to hear in the same way that we had heard the stories, data, and in some ways, this audience was the toughest one. It wasn't the one we had expected. We didn't realize they were going to have this power. And so working very closely with the president, working closely with students and others, we had a real nail biter, but eventually we were able to get a majority of the members of the College Council to agree to the name changes. The president then sent the suggestion, the recommendation of SUNY Central, and they very quickly approved the name changes. The next question was what to change them to. And there's certain rules here at SUNY, in the SUNY system about who you can name buildings or what you can name buildings after. So fortunately, one of our faculty, Anne Delant, who does a lot of biking, a lot of hiking, realized there were several bodies of water in the area that bore the names from the Ethiopians from centuries before. And following on her suggestion, this was a recommendation to take the names of these different, well, there were, I'm sorry, so birds, ponds, and things like that that were native to the area and name the buildings after those. So that's what we have now. So instead of Hasbrook, we've got Peregrine Complex. That's the generation of those names. And I think, so what's really important here is it's one thing to say we need to change the way we memorialize the past, but it's another to make sure that you really listen to people on all sides. I think that most of the people who were against changing the names felt listened to, worked very hard to hear what all sides were saying. They felt like the process was fair and open. And so as we went through the process of changing the names, we've had no disgruntlement to speak of. And it's been a smooth process once the College Council agreed to change the names. And now we no longer have the names of slaveholders on buildings on the SUNY campus. Thank you again to Jeff for inviting me. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them along with the other presenters.
Rennie, thanks a lot. Hold on. Okay, so yeah, I mean the thing that a few times that I've heard you speak and reading the speech, the thing that is is really important is it's all in the process. Mm-hmm. About hearing everybody. It's about creating open, transparent processes, doing your homework. Going back to the record, and that's where really it's the responsibility of us as the historians here to really weigh in on all of these things, and not from the point of view of our own personal opinion, but by using our expertise to really understand the process and to help the the process go forward in a fair and equitable way. So thank you for sharing that, because that's a really excellent sort of a template that we could use in general for many times. Thanks again. Okay, so it's time for questions and answers, and I thank the speakers for really honoring the time, and we're right on schedule here, and we're going to have a period of questions and answers. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to Susan Sprackman, who's going to be responsible for that. So thank you again for coming if you don't hear from me again before the end of the evening. And thanks to everyone who participated.
Okay, hi. So first, some logistics. If you want to ask a question, please go to the bottom of your navigation bar. There's a chat button and type in your question. We'd like you to keep your questions to 1 or 2 sentences, and we'll try to group questions by topic, so questions won't necessarily be asked in the order that they were submitted. And if yours is the only question on a specific topic, I will call your name, Karen will unmute you, and then you can ask your question. If there's a group of people asking similar questions, I'll read them together so that we can have them answered as a group. You can address your questions to the panel as a whole, or to Tyrone, Rennie, or Richard. And panel members, feel free to answer questions addressed to another panelist after that panelist has responded to his answers. And the overall theme that we'd like you to keep in mind as you're asking the questions and answering them is thinking of how we respond to the issues raised today as local and regional historians, as interpreters of history. How can we help to thoroughly and responsibly guide the discussions in our communities? And again, please limit the length of your questions to 1 or 2 sentences, and we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. So we seated ourselves. We wanted to make sure that we had questions to start while we waited for people to type in questions. And Susan Stessen Cohen had asked a question that actually Rennie answered, which was, how do you make sure that the buildings were named after the enslavers and not Huguenot descendants who donated money in the past? And I'd like to sort of build on that and ask, was there any thought, you know, when you, instead of just getting rid of the Hasbrook name, to sort of change the building to the Abraham Hasbrook name, or, you know, a way of sort of honoring a different Hasbrook rather than a founder?
We talked some about that, but the problem was that the link would be too strong still. So one of the things that we decided to do, you know, there was a concern among a number of the descendants of the Hasbrooks not to erase history. So we've done a couple things to avoid that. One is, in each of the buildings, there is a large plaque that talks about this history, talks about who the buildings used to be named for, who they were as people, what they did, and then why the university changed the names. A second thing is that the president charged us with developing some kind of contemplative space. So when we get the funding, we've looked into ways to create a place where these names will be enshrined, but also there'll be elements relating to the Esopus, there'll be elements relating to enslaved persons, there'll be elements relating to free blacks in the area, you know, so that it'll be a place where people can go, sit, and really put themselves in the place of thinking about the tragedies of history, the ironies, the solutions that people have developed, so that, you know, we have something that clearly is on campus, is a physical space, and doesn't just move it away. The third thing is to bring some of the knowledge that we learned into the classroom. And one of the crucial things is I wrote the history of slavery in New Paltz, and now I've made that an instrumental part of several of my classes. So when we talk about the history of slavery in the United States, I can show the students that it's not a distant thing, it happened right here.
Thank you. Ray Lefevre is one of our attendees today. And Ray, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, and we can see you as well.
Comment, Rennie, I'm a descendant of one of those patentees, and I've known for a long time in researching that they were slaveholders. I mean, Ralph Lefevre wrote in his History of New Paltz about how the Lefevres didn't work their slaves so hard. Well, they still had slaves. And so when I heard that they wanted to do this, I was like, absolutely. I said, I was not at all ever offended that they wanted to remove the Lefevre name off, I think it was the dormitory or something, because, you know, history evolves and changes, and it has to be honest. And, you know, we don't lose the history of the Lefevres because the name was taken off that building. So your presentation was really interesting. Just all the issues you had to deal with. So I just wanted to, you know, thank you for that, and let you know how one descendant, and I think our family association was like, yep, this has to happen. The name can't stay there, and we shouldn't be offended by that. So,
Well,
Rennie or other panelists, yeah.
Yes, thank you for that. And that's the crucial thing is here. You know, some people were worried about erasing the history, but the crucial thing is to remember that these are conflicts, and we've been through struggles, and, you know, our democracy is based on struggle of trying to find ways to create common ground and, you know, better community. And these are all important lessons to learn from the past. Thank you.
Okay. Richard or Tyrone, do you want to add to that?
Yeah,
Just pick up on. Go ahead, Tyrone.
No, I just wanted to agree about the it's the history of it and the pain that's behind the history is understandable. But when we all come to this common knowledge of, okay, identifying, you know, the pain of a name. But I like how the New Paltz community and the students, because I was engaging with a lot of students who was highly engaged at this point, and I really like how it was handled, because it became, you know, a communication. You know, everybody at the table, let's talk about it, and we, you know, nobody ran away from the pain it caused. Nobody ran away from the reality of what it is. And as Ray just said, as being a descendant, it was understandable, you know. So you also want to make sure in the process you're not offending, you know, others, you know, as Ray, who is a descendant too, you know. So it's not just about, you know, you don't want to try to heal one pain and cause another. So I'm just, you know, really grateful of how that whole transition happened. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, Susan Stessen Cohen has a comment related to that. Susan?
Just needed to unmute. Yeah, I just want to comment because recently we had, there's a playground in New Paltz, Hasbrook Park. There's a playground there. And the mayor of our town we're renaming the park it's actually the Julia Jackson Park, which will be there. But the larger park is called Hasbrook Park. And, you know, people were wondering about Hasbrook Park itself. But this is where you have to, like the investigation that Rennie did, Hasbrook Park was named in actually, I think it was 1918 or so, or sometime around that period, by Laura Talmadge Hasbrook as a memorial to World War I. So there you get into that whole other issue. Okay, it's Hasbrook Park, but it was named by Laura Talmadge Hasbrook as a memorial. There was a cannon there for World War I. So again, where Rennie did his investigation, like I wouldn't want them to rename the whole park, the Julia Jackson Park. So we're naming the playground that, and hopefully no one's going to want to change the park itself. But that's where, when you do your research and you know who it's named after, when it was named. So just, it was a comment like that.
Okay. Do any of the panelists want to respond to that?
Naming, well, a couple things going back. And I think Tyrone might have mentioned about curriculum, and sometimes there just needs to be basic education. You know, we're in the history business, and we, you know, people don't follow what we do all the time. I know I wrote an article years ago about slavery in Woodstock, and I actually had a couple of people come up to me and say, there were no slaves in Woodstock. I mean, it's Woodstock, there can't be slaves here. And I also had the same, I think Mr. Lefevre mentioned, I had the same comment too. But, well, if there were slaves here, they were treated pretty well, weren't they? Well, no, they were slaves. You know, so there is that need for basic education in our communities sometimes, and reminding people, you know, where we've come from. Now, in terms of naming things and stuff like that, we have streets in Woodstock, and I guess maybe Rennie can, you know, the work that has to go into parsing out who is who in this genealogy. But we have streets with names that of former slave owners. Where the lines diverge, where the family splits, that's the difficulty that I have in trying to find those threads. But you know, so it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and I appreciate what New Paltz has done.
Okay. Rennie, Ty, Ron, either one of you want to comment? No? Okay, Peter Bunton has a comment, a question? Hi, Peter.
Hi, this is for Reynolds, I guess, but in general, since there's a lot of discussion going on about memorials, is how do we make the decision to change a memorial? So how do we make the decision? And I'm asking specifically, and I came late, so perhaps you address this, but directly, did the Huguenots whose names were on the SUNY buildings, did they bring or offer or create anything else in history that they might be valued for? Or did you just look at them as owners of enslaved people?
Well, thank you for the question. The crucial thing was to determine whether, as I noted in the presentation, whether the buildings were named after the families or after those original patentees. So as for the original patentees, they created a society with slavery in it. And so that was the major thing. It wasn't specifically, did you own a slave or not? They clearly created a society with slaves, as Ira Berlin would call it, there in New Paltz. We have a similar issue now going on here in Kingston with the 3 statues that are in Academy Green Park. So there are different criteria that you can develop. One of the big questions, of course, is should we change the names of things named after George Washington or Thomas Jefferson because they were slaveholders? And there, of course, you've got much more information and you can create a much more subtle portrait of those folks and put them into a context where, you know, they were engaged in some things that ultimately led to the demise of slavery. So you can argue that back and forth. With the patentees, it was much more difficult because there's no biography of them that really details the ins and outs of their lives. So our focus was on this question of, did they own slaves, and were the buildings named after people who created a slave society? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I think, you know, as pointing up George Washington or Jefferson, sometimes this gets more complicated in terms of how we today versus people 100 years ago. How do we view the past and create memorials which we are then going to hand down to our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren? So I was just asking because I think it's oftentimes a very difficult question to discuss and figure out what our answer is going to be here. I think what you presented in terms of the New Paltz situation was a very thorough procedure. And people are grappling with this issue now in terms of memorials, tearing down, building new ones, etc. And we're living in a period now, I don't know how long it will last, but we're really in a period now where more people are being sensitized to the history of enslavement in this country. And personally, I think it's right that we are looking at this in terms of how are we looking at our memorials? How are we thinking about creating new memorials? 100 years from now, the people living at that time, or 150 years, there may be some other thing that comes forward in society that causes them to relook.
Thank you. Suzanne Hasbrook.
Hi. I had a question for Tyrone about Harambee. I know you're a very new organization with a very thrilling piece of property to do research on. And has there been any ability to discover who is buried there and what possible stories might come out from that situation?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. So there was research, obviously, that we got from Mr. Ed Ford and Joe Diamond, who originally found this land in 1980. As we continue to research and try to, you know, find more information, we have been realizing that documentation of the enslaved Africans that came over is not a lot of information that was kept. So we turned our attention into following the ships. There's this great documentation on the ships that went to Africa and came back to the lands. So we started to turn our attention that way because there is great documentations on where the ships docked, in Africa and where they docked, here in America. We are in plans next year to do tour Zoom-ins with the collaboration with Joe Diamond and others at SUNY New Paltz, that we will Zoom two remains possibly and do DNA testing on those remains, and those remains will be held for a little while at the college, hopefully as we move forward. And so that's the plans, and we have a great idea. Just trying to wait for some little more information to come in, but we have a great idea where the ships was coming from in Africa, where they docked in Africa. So that's the kind of only telling that we really have, because as far as names, they didn't have any, they did not keep their names when they came here to the States. They just took either no names or the slave owner names.
Right. Excellent. Thank you.
Susan?
Okay, somehow I got muted. Okay, Rennie, Richard, do you want to add something?
No, and maybe Susan Stessen can help on this too. I have a similar question that Suzanne just asked. I've tried to look into, say at its peak before 1827, maybe we had 1920 slaves in Woodstock. I've found traces of a couple of their lives after 1827, but going beyond that is extremely difficult. I mean, we have Overseer of the Poor books and things like that, and I wondered if Susan had any tips on that. She's there? Maybe she's not there.
Sorry, who did you need
Susan,
to?
Susan Stessen Cohen.
You're not there? No.
Oh, okay.
I'm here.
Oh, okay, go for it, Susan.
I lost everybody for a minute on my computer. It went down, and then I was trying to regroup. Richard, can you just say that question, that part of it?
Suzanne brings up a good point. It's identifying former slaves after 1827. I'm sure they didn't go far, but the records, at least locally here in Woodstock, are terrible.
Well,
and I found a couple, but and they basically stayed with their former masters. But beyond that, I've lost track of about a bunch of them.
I guess for me, where I've been going back to, because that's what I'm working on now. I'm starting. Ashley and I, who is the co-author of our In Defiance book, we started in 1940, and we're going backwards. We're looking at people that lived in New Paltz. We're going back. So we're going to 1790, we're going through every census. And then in New Paltz, we're very lucky because the town owns the original manumission ledger. So from 1799 on, we're able to see the first names of these children that were born.
The children, right.
Right. So I've been doing that, newspaper clippings. And really it's going through the wills, going through all the old wills.
That's where I found a couple in wills. Yep.
Wills, and Huguenot Street has quite a few. They have for sales, people that their documents there about people that were sold. There's quite a bit of information, I have to say, in the archives at HHS. They have incredible information because many of those Huguenots did keep everything. So there's information about like shoes that were bought for an enslaved person. A lot of the letters, they're old letters. I found some up at state archives and some also locally that they talk about the names of the enslaved people that lived in different households. So, if I had time, there'd be more, but there are ways to locate names of people.
We'll talk.
Yeah, we have looked at a lot of some things with the Huguenot. I actually went over there and went to the Huguenot house over there where I sat down. A lot of the names that we that we do have, because we do have some of the names. But the term that we realized, those was given names, you know, and we know that those was given names. So the reason why we looking at where the ships was docked, because we can locate the tribes based on where the ships was docked at in Africa. And when you look at it, you can locate the tribes that was in those areas. And it helps us a lot to you know, understand the tribes where where several came from Africa to the mainlands. But a lot of the names that we've seen that we did get from Huguenot were not African names,
Right.
and those were given names.
Okay, great. We have one more question, and this is from the group of us that organized the conference, and it's you know, a little after 8:30, so it's about the time we're going to end, so it's maybe an appropriate question. We focused today on the African American experience. Are there any groups besides the English and Dutch settlers that we should explore in discussing Ulster's early history? And that could perhaps feed into the next conference, or the one that we organize after that. So first, I'd like to ask our panelists, and Susan, you know, jump in too.
Well, if I understand the question, this is Rennie, Scott-Childress.
Yeah.
Clearly, you know, there needs to be more research done into the Esopus, the Indians who were here at the very beginning. And I think too that a way of approaching this would be much more beneficial. I was happy to hear Tyrone talking about the way that enslaved peoples and early Black Americans have often been portrayed simply as victims, simply as folks who couldn't, you know, direct their own fates. And there's a different way of looking at a lot of this history, which is to, instead of, you know, do the history of one group per se, really look at how all the different groups interacted with each other and affected each other. So you look at, you know, how an economy works rather than how white people benefited or enslaved people rebelled. You look at it in that much richer context of how people are involved with each other and to see what struggles they're going through. And then the frame is, what culture did they create together? So that you're able to bring in much more of this idea of everybody being involved. Some people clearly would have more power than others, but the aim here is to demonstrate that nobody is completely without power. You know, anybody who reads Sojourner Truth's narrative sees that she's got lots of ways to push her point of view of try to get things done in a very difficult kind of circumstance. And so I think less than what group to focus on, that to me is something much more, that would be equally interesting, is how did they engage in different kinds of cultural exchanges and for some people in very difficult circumstances.
That's really a great idea. Thanks. Richard, Tyrone, anything to add there?
Well, as I don't, again, I'm not sure if groups are the right way to go or not, just as Rennie was saying, but this conversation this evening, I think, may deserve a part 2 at some point. I don't know if that's the next one or not, but I think there's more exploration to be done here as well.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, we're at the end of our time. We had about 50 people on the conference, so that's a really great showing. And I don't know, Jeff, if you want to say anything in closing, or just leave it to me. We lost Jeff.
Hold on.
There you are. Okay.
No, whoops. I am thrilled with the way the conference turned out. I love the questions. I love the interactions, and this has been great. And I want to thank everyone who participated. It's been wonderful, so thank you. And we will be coming up with another mini conference. We're all going to meet at some point, and we will decide what that will be. We have a number of ideas on the table, so please watch your email. And this was our dry run, so hopefully, since this went so smoothly and easily, that we can do many more of these.
Yeah. And Jeff, can we add that if people have ideas of what they would like us to cover in a conference, please send Jeff an email.
Yes.
You know, it doesn't all have to come just from us. We'd love to respond to your thoughts.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for mentioning that. And my email, most of you have, but it's either gmill at, what is it, county.ulster.ny.us. Is that it? I don't know. Or better, gmiller1931 at gmail.com. So, okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks Susan for taking this on. Thanks Karen behind the scenes for making this such a smooth presentation. Thanks. Okay.